Okay, let's try to get through as much of chapter 14 as we can. So now we're going to learning and memory, and have an idea of the differences between short-term and long-term memory. So short-term memory is retention of information for a few seconds to a few minutes. And short-term memory is called short-term because it doesn't last. The way it lasts is if you reinforce it by making yourself continuously go over the information, just like studying. When I was in school, I wasn't good at studying. I didn't learn how to study until, I was just about to graduate. And so what I would do, I would sit in class and everything the teacher talked about made sense. I understood it. But 2 weeks later on the test, I didn't remember anything she said. So when I say study every day, it's because I know that's what it takes for it to stick. Everything else is short term if you're not continuously going over. So where you see it says reinforcement, that's the studying every day. If you go over it all the time, there's no way for it not to stick. Okay, so when students tell me, I've been studying every day. No. If you study every day, you're not going to make a 30. I'm sorry, on my test. You're not. You don't make it to this level. If you have some type of deficiency, you probably would not have made it to AMP2 or even AMP1. But and then some students just don't know how to study. That's something else I've learned, that some students just think reading the book and just reading from the beginning to the end nonstop, that's not studying. You have to stop, break down what you're reading, and make sense of what you're reading, and then go over it that way. But I digress. So short-term versus long-term memory. Short-term memory can transfer again to long-term memory, but it requires rehearsal, repetition. Information is stored for later recall, and that requires mental alertness. And what does that mean? What I think about there is some students say they are able to study while watching TV and listening to music. Well, your focus is somewhere else. So how is what you're reading going to stick? Because you're not really trying to understand what it is you're studying. So you have to be alert and focused in on what it is you're reading. And then procedural memory is also called motor memory or physical memory of movements. And you think back to either kids, that you try to teach them to tie their shoes, ride a bicycle, and how difficult it was at first. But after repetition, doing it over and over, they do it without thinking. Typing was always amazing to me because when I first started taking a typing class, of course I had to look at every letter. And then by the end of the class, my fingers are gone. And I'm not even looking at the keys, and my fingers just know where to go. And that is procedural memory. Athletes who are good, for example, baseball players who are good at hitting the ball, basketball players who are good at making baskets, good shooters, all that involves procedural memory. And that's not something you can develop overnight. Again, procedural memory requires, how many people learn how to tie their shoe in one day? How many learn to type in one day? Don't lie. So did any of you learn how to type in one day? No. So
it's 6 years. I had typing class 28 years ago.
Exactly.
As well as I
It's there. It's like a computer program. The neurons that are involved, you have a network of neurons, and once they develop that, it's there with procedural memory. I have a friend who played in the NBA. He's 55 now, and he still goes out. He played for Kansas right after Wilt Chamberlain left, and he broke one of Wilt Chamberlain's scoring records. So he brags about what a great three-point shooter he was before they even had three-pointers. And he'll still go in and shoot three-point shots and make 9 out of 10 at 55, and he hadn't played in 20-some years. So that is, and what he said was when he was 5, you couldn't take a basketball out of his hand. He slept with his basketball, got up before school, shooting basketball. So we think when we see Kobe Bryant on TV that he just started playing all of a sudden. But this guy actually played with Kobe's dad and said that Kobe was at every practice when he was about 3 or 4 years old. So Kobe was around basketball at a very young age. And look at people like Tiger Woods. I mean, when you start that young and you're really into it, you can't help but to develop that procedural memory. Huh? Especially with golf. Mm-hmm. And also baseball. You all ever try to hit a baseball? It's not that bad? Okay. My son played baseball when he was younger.
There's a deficit between people that are completely unathletic and people that pick it up so easily.
Yeah, some people just have it naturally. I guess where those connections come faster, just like intelligence. Some people can read the book one time and have it. So those neurons, I guess, just work together better in certain of us than others. Yeah, that's a good point.
There is
But
a natural born athlete.
yeah, I truly believe that. Mm-hmm. And then there are a lot that are not. Women? He said he said some women try to make athletes out of their kids. Men do too. Men try to make athletes. When my son played baseball, I remember he played with one of the coaches he played against, his team played against, had 2 sons on his team. One of them was very athletic, and the other was kind of soft. And he stayed on that boy so hard. I mean, I almost wanted to cry for the little boy. He didn't want to be out there, but the guy pushed him. So it's not just moms pushing. Dads are kind of crazy in sports. When it comes to their sons in sports, yeah. Okay. We'll skip through this. You all can go through it. The thalamus. All right, so now we get into the functions of the different parts of the brain. I call those the functional areas. And so what is it? So some of these you all will see throughout the chapters that we go through, such as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is one of those very important parts of the brain that controls so many different things, such as homeostasis, body temperature. So when you feel hot or cold, that's the work of your hypothalamus. It also controls the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, which we'll talk about next week. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. You did ask me about that, yeah. And it also influences the heartbeat, blood flow, and hormone secretion. The main thing about the thalamus to know is that it, so remember when sensory information travels up the spinal cord through ascending tracts, those sensory signals or neurons travel through the thalamus. So the thalamus is sort of a relay station for all sensory information going to the brain. So it directs the sensory information coming in to the correct part of the brain. And some of the hypothalamus functions, again, hormone secretion, autonomic effects we just mentioned, and thermoregulation. So remember when our body temperature is too low, what happens? We shiver, and when it's too hot, we sweat. So it's actually the hypothalamus receiving the signal and sending out the commands to the correct effectors to fix the problem. Also, our feeling of hunger and thirst, controlled by the hypothalamus. Our rhythm of sleep and wakefulness, memory to some degree, and emotional behavior to some degree are controlled by the hypothalamus. The main thing I want you all to know about the midbrain is, the cranial nerves, for one, So there are how many cranial nerves? Name them. So for the test next week, you all will have to tell me what part of the brain cranial nerves 2 through 12 are located. Okay, 3 through 12. So cranial nerves 3 and 4 are attached to the midbrain. And so that's the number one thing to know about the midbrain. Also, that is the most superior part of the brainstem. If you look at the picture, which I don't think is close, but the midbrain is the superior. Then you have the pons and medulla.
Can you pronounce that glosso? I can't pronounce it. Can you pronounce it?
Glossopharyngeal.
Okay, I was talking something else. Okay.
Did you spell it right?
I spelled it. Oh.
Okay. So you spelled it right. The glossopharyngeal. Okay, and the substantia nigra. So the midbrain contains a part called the substantia nigra, and that comes from there's some darkly stained nuclei there. Remember, gray matter is dark, but the substantia nigra has darker pigmentation in those nuclei, and the melanin concentration is just higher in that area. So the substantia nigra. Now, what's important about this is that it has something to do with Parkinson's disease. So the substantia nigra is affected in individuals who have Parkinson's. The neurons in that area, the neurons in the substantia nigra, start to degenerate, and that is what leads to the tremors of Parkinson's disease. Okay, and this somewhat explains what happens there. So what happens is the substantia nigra is supposed to send inhibitory signals to another part of the brain called the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are constantly sending out signals to cause muscles telling muscles to contract. Okay, but those are going to occur when we don't want them to. So the basal nuclei sends out uncontrolled signals to the muscles, whereas this part, the neurons of the substantia nigra inhibit the basal nuclei. So you have an idea then, if this part is not inhibiting the basal nuclei, then the basal nuclei is going to be successful in what? Sending out signals to the muscles, causing them to contract involuntarily. So that's where the tremors come from in Parkinson's disease. These neurons that are supposed to inhibit those movements are not working. So the movements are taken over. Okay, so you all should associate the midbrain with the substantia nigra with Parkinson's disease. Okay, tie those together. All right, so the pons is the origination part of the CNS for the cranial nerves 5 through 8. So cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 are located in the pons. And the pons is located where? Between the medulla and the midbrain. And functionally, the main functions that you all will need to know about is the nuclei help to maintain normal rhythm of breathing, normal breathing rhythm, and also it has some effect on sleep and breathing, sleep, breathing, and posture. The medulla oblongata contains the cardiac center, vasomotor center, respiratory, and reflex centers. And the cranial nerves, the rest of the cranial nerves, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are located on the medulla oblongata. And so what do we mean by center? We have all these centers. Cardiac center. So if I tell you the cardiac center is located in the medulla oblongata, what does that mean? The cardiac center.
Concentration from receptors.
Hmm. The concentration of neurons that actually control the heart. Okay? So, again, the brain controls just about everything in our body. So, what part of the brain is what we're talking about when we say the cardiac center? So, the cardiac center is in what part of the brain? The medulla. So, the medulla is the part of the brain that controls the heart rate and the force of the heartbeat. So, we'll talk when we get to the next chapter, the autonomic nervous system, about the system being able to speed up the heart rate or slow down the heart rate. Okay, so the neurons that control that originate in the cardiac center, in the medulla. So the vasomotor center, so that's the part of the medulla that controls the blood vessel diameter. Why would we need to control blood vessel diameter? Any idea? Regulate blood pressure. Good. Okay, so regulate. So if you dilate the blood vessel, that lowers pressure. If you constrict it, it increases pressure. And we'll talk more about the blood pressure later. Respiratory centers control the rate and depth of breathing. Okay, and then the reflex centers for coughing, sneezing, gagging, swallowing, vomiting, salivation, and sweating. So these are all reflexes that we tend to take for granted. Coughing, but I'd like for you all to think about why are these reflexes important and what would life be like if we did not have these reflexes. So if we couldn't cough. Right. So if we didn't have the coughing reflex, we can make ourselves cough, right? But the reflex comes when there's something actually that is in there that we may not recognize. So it protects our lungs from setting up infection. Sneezing, why do we need to sneeze? Clear the nasal passages for the same reason, right? Because whatever we're inhaling through our nose can end up what? In our lungs and set up infection. Gagging, why do we gag? Okay, so gagging is not important. What about swallowing? So swallowing, so again, think of these as things you're not controlling. They're automatic. Okay? So swallowing, so basically the way it's set up, whoever built the body is basically saying if something hits the back of your throat, you need to either swallow it or get it out of there, right? Because it's cutting off what? Airflow.
Isn't that what gagging plays?
Yes. Okay, so gagging, where gagging comes in, is to clear the throat. If something is not going to be swallowed, then it needs to get out of there so we can continue to breathe normally. Why do we need to be able to vomit? Alcohol. To get that alcohol. Why? Why do you need to get alcohol out? Why not let it stay? Mm-hmm. So alcohol is a poison, right? So we shouldn't really drink alcohol, should we? So spirits. So that's correct. If you have such a high concentration of alcohol in your stomach, where's the next place it's going? Into your blood. Well, it's going to your blood, and then it's going to circulate to your liver. But since it's poisonous, the body doesn't want it to get into the blood, right? Because it can do harm to other organs. So it tries to get anything poisonous.
Even if you're unconscious, you still try to get it down.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a reflex. Exactly. So that's where the gagging, I was about to mention that. So throwing up and gagging are two different things, right? Throwing up just gets it out of our stomach to our throat. Gagging is what gets it out of our throat. Okay? And exactly. From it going to the wrong pipe. It prevents aspiration, where you can suffocate by getting food and fluid into the airway. And that's actually why if you have to go into the hospital, they tell you not to eat or drink anything after midnight, they always say. And there's a reason for that. What's the reason? Sometimes anesthesia causes you to become nauseated and may cause you to throw up. Well, what happens is the anesthesia knocks out these reflexes. It knocks out pretty much all those reflexes. And the problem is, so you won't be able to gag, but you won't be able to vomit either. So what's the problem? Well, when the anesthesia wears off, your ability to vomit comes back first. So if you're still asleep, you can vomit, but gagging isn't back yet. Your gagging reflex, so there's no way for you to get the vomit out of the back of your throat until that comes back.
Dr. you know how you see a lot of things like it's poisonous, and it says if you drink it, you don't induce vomiting? Is that because it would go through?
Like you drain over something, and they say don't throw up and drink some milk.
You know, I'm not sure why. The only thing I can think of is because it may do damage coming up. That's the only thing I can think of.
They said it's supposed to. That's what causes a lot of people to aspirate. Is that process? But when you drink milk, milk is a constant that explodes in and coats the stomach and surrounds the poison. That's why.
So they say to drink milk.
Yeah, milk is always the thing to drink because when you drink milk, milk is such a big constant, and it secretes all over everything else, and it has to.
Okay, interesting.
Why do you drink skim milk?
It wouldn't do the same as milk coats your stomach. Milk doesn't coat your stomach. It increases your mucus. And
The production of the mucus, yeah.
See, I wondered if because you know, sometimes if you drink alcohol, and you do throw up, a minute later, you're a lot drunker than you were 5 minutes earlier.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it had anything to do with.
You said you're a lot drunker?
Yeah.
So I wonder if it had anything to do with it going through your bloodstream quicker.
Well, that's a good point. Like it's a redistribute or something when you throw up. I know what he means.
I don't know. I hadn't experienced that one. You all are telling on yourselves.
Or you can tell them what they heard.
One other thing, if you all have noticed, so if you don't drink or eat anything after midnight and after whatever procedure, you're hungry, right? So one time I was in the hospital and I was hungry after I woke up. So they asked if I wanted crackers, and I said, yeah, sure. And they forgot to bring my water, but I went ahead and tore open the crackers and started eating them, peanut butter crackers. And salivation, no, mouth was completely dry. And I thought I was going to die. I did. I was, please, Harry, I couldn't speak because it was all in the back of my throat. I was trying to swallow it. It wouldn't go down. Ugh, almost a disaster. Okay. In the cerebellum, the main functions of the cerebellum are coordination, coordinated voluntary muscle, helps to maintain balance and muscle tone, and also depth perception, spatial awareness. If you think about alcohol's effect on the brain, the cerebellum is one of those affected most by alcohol consumption. So if you consume too much alcohol, notice you'll lose balance, controlled by the cerebellum to a degree. And also your spatial awareness, which is why you shouldn't drive, right? You may think a car is further away than it actually is, and jump right out there in front of it. Yeah. Bessemer Superhighway? Drink and drive? No, that's not smart. Okay. All right, and then the meninges. We're back talking about the meninges again. So the meninges, you have the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. And just remember the layers and the order. And you can see the cerebrum here without the meninges on one side, and then with the pia and arachnoid on the other, as well as blood vessels. And notice again the gray matter versus the white matter. So the darker gray matter is on the outside. There you go. And meningitis, I don't know if we talked about meningitis before, did we? So inflammation of the meninges caused by bacterial or viral invasion of the CNS, usually by way of the nose or throat. And bacterial meningitis can cause swelling of the brain, enlarging the ventricles. So the ventricles, remember, are those spaces that contain CSF. And also it can cause hemorrhaging. Some signs of meningitis are high fever, stiff neck, and I highlighted stiff neck because that makes it different from some other types of problems an individual can have, such as the flu. So a person with the flu will also have high fever, maybe an intense headache, drowsiness, but the stiff neck is kind of what makes meningitis stand out. Death within hours of onset can occur. Okay. And I had a friend who, did I tell you about that story? I had a friend who, his girlfriend took him to the emergency room because he had just been feeling bad for a couple of days, and he thought it was just the flu. He was just going to sleep it off. But she made him get up, and she took him to the emergency room. And the first place she took him, they told him he just had dehydration and a touch of the flu, which he was getting over, that he can just go home and sleep it off, and he'd be fine. Well, the girlfriend didn't buy it, so she took him to another emergency room. And as soon as he got there, they told him to move his head, and he couldn't. So, and they saw that he had fever, so they admitted him immediately and told him if he had gone home, he may not have lived. Yeah. Huh?
The first place said he took him, or she took him, well, then she didn't want to do her job, or they didn't want to run more tests?
We just didn't give a darn, basically. And this wasn't here. This was in Florida somewhere. You see it. I told him he should have married that girl. She saved his life.
He married?
Nah. Okay. This is stuff we've gone over, epidural, subdural, so we'll keep on moving. CSF. So what is the function of CSF? Cerebrospinal fluid. So it keeps the spinal cord lubricated and also the brain lubricated. It provides buoyancy. Let's see what that is. So buoyancy, right, is sort of like floating. So the brain doesn't just sit on the base of the skull, right? It's kind of suspended in CSF. And you can imagine why that's important. Because if the brain just sat, exactly, if the brain was sitting on the skull, every time we moved our head, it would slip and slide and kill those cells. So it kind of suspended in the CSF.
Why is it that you get a headache? What is it about that causes you to get a headache?
A spinal bleed, because there's a change in the intracranial pressure. So even if it's a decrease, even with CSF, so some people have an issue with either they're getting rid of CSF faster than they're making it, or they're making more than they're getting rid of, which can cause hydrocephalus. And both of those can cause intense headache because of the change in pressure within the skull. But remember we said the brain has no, what? Pain receptors. Remember that? So it's the other structures within there, such as the blood vessels and the meninges and the skull, which result in the headaches.
That's why they've seen on TV they can actually do brain operations for the personal body.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Exactly. And that's how they, you know how we know the pre-central gyrus and post-central gyrus functions? They actually, the way they would do it, they would, for one, you can see what part of the brain is damaged in a person who has a stroke, and you can see the result of that. But what they also started to do is open the skull and just stimulate a part of the brain and see what the person said they felt, or actually see what part of the body moved. And part of the brain, like the amygdala, they may feel angry all of a sudden, or fear. So that's how they came up with some of the information they have now.
So if they were to do that to somebody that's paraplegic,
What?
and they were to send maybe a electric shock or a probe to a certain part.
Right.
Their
So
legs or a
so if they're
toe or
paraplegic, that's the motor division, right? And if they're paraplegic, it depends on why. If the damage is in the spinal cord, stimulating the brain is still not going to get the signal to the muscle. So they still wouldn't move. But if you did it to the primary sensory cortex, if you stimulated the post-central gyrus in a person who was paralyzed or something, they would feel like, okay, something is sticking me in my arm. Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then we have the brain ventricles. And the ventricles, again, are the spaces within the brain, and they contain CSF. About 500 milliliters, half a liter of CSF is produced and drained from the CNS daily. So the same amount that is produced obviously has to leave, or there will be an imbalance of CSF, and that does occur sometimes. And these are the brain ventricles, and you'll have a picture similar to this. Yours is slightly different, but you have an idea of where they're located. On the theory exam next week, I may ask you to trace the path of CSF from the lateral ventricles. So you have to tell me where CSF goes when it leaves the lateral ventricles. And that is in order right here. Through the interventricular foramen. Any idea why this is called interventricular foramen? Interventricular, that word first. Inter means inside the ventricle, or inter meaning between as well. So the interventricular foramen is between the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle. Okay, and it's called a foramen because it's a little hole connecting those two ventricles. Then you have the third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, and fourth ventricle. And then CSF continues down in the center of the spinal cord, the central canal, and some of it comes out to bathe the outside of the brain and spinal cord through the median and lateral apertures, which are not on this picture. Okay. So the flow of CSF. Blood supply to the brain supplies nutrients and oxygen to the brain, just like any other tissue. In fact, the brain uses a lot more oxygen, makes a lot more ATP than the other tissues of the body. We'll get to the blood vessels later. The internal carotid arteries and vertebral arteries delivers blood to the brain, and the CO2-rich blood is removed from the brain by way of the dural sinuses. Let's get there. Cerebrovascular disease, CVA, you all have heard of that? Cerebrovascular accident is the technical name for strokes. So strokes are called CVAs. And what is going on with a stroke? What is a stroke? Good. That's simple. It's an interruption of blood supply or blood flow to a particular part of the brain. Okay, it could be by way of a clot, which is probably the most common, a blood clot, but also people who have cholesterol, high cholesterol, some of those plaques can break off and travel through the arteries and get stuck in a narrow artery. So that's a stroke too, because it's interrupting blood flow, getting past that point to the place it's supposed to go. Okay, and that causes the neurons to die. And then the blood-brain barrier, really you all don't need to know a whole lot about it, except that the brain protects itself. So not everything that's in the blood can get into the brain, and that's just a protective mechanism. You have tight junctions that prevent some substances in blood from getting over into the brain. And some medications, for example, have to be altered because they don't go directly into the from the bloodstream into the brain. Exactly. Right. So there are some chemicals, for example, for cancer treatment, you may be able to treat cancer chemically on some parts of the body, but some of those chemicals will not get into the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. Okay. And electroencephalogram record brainwave activities, and these are the normal brain waves, as you can see. And really what I expect you all to know here, just know them by name, the types of brain waves, alpha, beta, theta, and delta. And the question I usually ask on the test is usually one or two, usually just one question. Asking, for example, which type of wave should you be exhibiting while you're sitting here taking the test? And which one would you say? Beta? Right. Mentally alert. Hopefully you're mentally alert, but I know some students stay up all night studying, so they're falling asleep, so they may have alpha waves. Okay? Delta waves in deep sleep. I have had students to actually sleep during a test. Okay. Huh? My class? A student in my class. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. Maybe on drugs. Maybe had too much alcohol. Okay, a few disorders. Tumors, inflammation, hemorrhage, gliomas, neuromas, meningiomas. And these are just, I guess, based on where they originate. So a gliomas are tumors arising from glial cells. And one of the things about the brain, the neurons don't duplicate. So remember, the neurons that we are born with are the ones we're going to have till we die. Okay? And the number of neurons we have decreases as we age. Okay? So some people may wonder then, and I've had students ask, well, if we don't make new neurons, that's what cancer is, overproduction or cells undergoing mitosis when they're not supposed to. But usually in the brain, it's actually the glial cells that are undergoing mitosis and forming the tumors. And a neuroma is a tumor arising from nerves, and meningiomas are tumors arising from meninges. And cerebral palsy is referred to as a group of neuromuscular disorders that result from injury to an infant before, during, or shortly after delivery. So sometimes there's just brain damage in the process or the course of childbirth. All forms cause impairment of skeletal muscle activity. Mental retardation and speech difficulty may also accompany cerebral palsy. And epilepsy is a disorder in which neurons of the brain fire suddenly and unpredictably. So the neurons just start to send signals for no apparent reason, and may be caused by tumors. And most of the time, they are caused by tumors or some type of trauma or toxins. And every now and then, if a fever gets very high, that can result in seizures as well. Grand mal seizures, motor areas firing repeatedly, causing convulsive seizures and loss of consciousness. So notice the difference between grand mal and petit mal seizures. One has motor, the motor part of the brain is affected, whereas the petit mal, you have the sensory parts of the brain affected. So with sensory, remember, that doesn't involve movement. So it does not accompany convulsions and prolonged unconsciousness. Okay, and we just talked about stroke. You can go back through this. Blood supply to the brain. I mentioned how important blood flow to the brain is. So if for some reason we're low on blood, let's just say an individual is hemorrhaging, what happens is the blood vessels start to constrict to make sure blood is continuously getting to the brain. So it's not until you're almost out of blood that you are going to shut down completely, especially for young individuals, young adults who may be in a car accident. They always tell you should go get checked out even though you feel like you're okay, because you could be bleeding internally and feel fine. But later on, you could lose so much blood that you become disoriented, and by that time it's too late. So it's better to get checked out early than late. So what are the effects of 10 seconds of interruption of blood flow to the brain? Loss of consciousness. So just 10 seconds, loss of consciousness. 1 to 2 minute interruption can cause significant impairment of neural function, and then 4 minutes without blood supply to the brain causes irreversible brain damage. I remember seeing a report about, preteens start doing silly things, and there was a young boy, I think about 12, 13 years old, who used to play with a belt, squeeze his neck, and it would shut off blood supply, squeezing his carotid arteries, shutting off blood supply to his brain. And they kind of get off on that because it's a weird feeling they get, and then they loosen it up, and, it's funny. Ooh, ooh. But this one kid, he was put on punishment, so he was upstairs playing around. They thought he committed suicide, but the person doing the autopsy saw that he had old marks on his neck where he had been doing that before, and they said it was probably an accident where he squeezed and I guess didn't let go fast enough, and he was unconscious and couldn't loosen it up and restore blood flow.
You seen the other day when they said that man was dead like 17 minutes? They did CPR.
Where was he? I think I read something like that.
Like a week ago.
I think so. I think I heard something like that. Yeah. But it depends. I've heard of that happening for people who fall through ice.
Yeah.
And they're under the ice for a long period of time.
It's so cold.
Yeah. It just slows metabolism and everything down. Right.
Yeah, they did talk about, he went to church with me. He was a good kid, so I mean, suicide.
Okay.
He went for a while.
Yeah.
His band was great. I heard about it one day. I was down at the farm. Dad called me and told me he passed away. I noticed he was really rough. So it was pretty sad.
Yeah. And I think one of his friends may have told the parents that they used to do that. Yeah, because they were all messed up that he committed suicide. So I guess it feels a little better that it was an accident. All right. All right, I think that's enough for today.